I recently put out a video titled, Should the GH5 Go Full Frame? Well, my basic point was just that I think Panasonic should develop a larger sensor size camera. It doesn't have to be the GH5, it doesn't have to be the GH line, it doesn't even necessarily need to be full frame. It could be Super 35, or it could even be medium format for all I care. Just something bigger than Micro Four Thirds. And that was essentially the point. And Four Thirds Rumors picked it up and put online, which I'm actually really happy that they shared it. That's awesome. Thank you for doing that. And there's a lot of comments, a lot of hate, which is awesome, right? You love that on the internet, love the hate. So we're going to actually read through some of those comments right now. And I'm just going to do kind of an off-the-cuff response. I haven't really read through any of these. And we're just going to see if they've got some good points or if maybe they weren't understanding me or maybe we just see things differently. So let's take a look. From Monster in My Bag. Personally, I'm fine with Micro Four Thirds, but I would like them to touch the realm of Super 35. Okay, so bring back the multi-aspect sensor and stop cropping the already cramped sensor. I totally agree. I think the crop in 4K on the GH4 is aggressive, and you're not even getting Micro Four Thirds at that point. Super thin depth of field is a one-trick pony and totally achievable with Micro Four Thirds if the project requires it. As for stills photography, any argument for full frame over Micro Four Thirds is like a Micro Four Thirds and full frame guy arguing over penis size, while the medium format users just chuckle. That's probably true. Panasonic should just concentrate on making the best Micro Four Thirds sensor and camera they can, but if I was them, I'd be leaking some tasty rumors before too many people feel compelled to move over to Sony for better or worse. And he really hits on something there at the end about people moving to Sony that was kind of the main point, or one of the main points of my initial video, is that I love the cameras Panasonic makes. I just wish they up the sensor size to actually compete with Sony, because almost everything about the GH4 is better, in my opinion, than what the A7 cameras offer. But the A7 cameras have the bigger sensor, as well as a few other features like in-body stabilization. But overall, I think the GH4 is a much better camera, and I just want to see someone compete with Sony because I really don't like the Sony bodies, the small batteries, the overheating, the flip screen. I've made tons of videos about this stuff. I just really don't like the form factor and the hardware that Sony implements, so I really wish Panasonic would step in and offer some competition. M. Jr. says, the problem with this video is that the guy is in a bubble. Well, that is probably true. I don't know everyone else out there, but I would also guess that the people on Four Thirds Rumors are also in a bubble. I can't imagine too many people outside of the Four Thirds ecosystem are coming to this site. Hey, who knows, but that could be the case. San Francisco Santos says, just a random opinion on the internet. No reason to be heard since there are too many opinions for that matter. There are a lot of opinions out there. I mean, that's what YouTube is for general people just sharing their opinions. Most of the stuff on my channel, I try and give tips, but I guess this was a purely opinion piece. The original video was anyway. A Traveler says, for real professionals, Panasonic makes the VariCam V35 with a Super 35 sensor. Sony's professional Cine Alta cameras use a Super 35 sensor. Canon's professional C100, C300, and C500 all use Super 35 sensors. Well, I will say that all those cameras are quite a bit more expensive than the GH4 or A7S for that matter, but I guess that's not the point he's trying to make. The multiple Academy Award-winning Hurt Locker was shot in Super 16, so was The Black Swan, which earned Natalie Portman an Oscar for Best Actress. I don't know what that has to do with Super 16, but okay. By the way, Super 16 is a smaller format than Micro Four Thirds. Therefore, Micro Four Thirds should be good for anything from local commercials all the way to feature films. Absolutely, 100%. I think Micro Four Thirds is fantastic. That's why I own a GH4 and use one almost exclusively. However, that is not tapping into one of my points, which was to stay competitive against Sony, they have to offer something else. I didn't say ditch Micro Four Thirds. In fact, I said it's probably good if they don't abandon it, but they need to have something a little bit bigger, because what I would hate for it to happen is in the long run, Sony just dominates and Panasonic isn't able to keep their Lumix line afloat and they have to cancel it altogether, because that would be really unfortunate. And I'm not saying I think that's going to happen. I don't think that's likely to happen. But when you look at the best-selling cameras, which I actually have right here on Amazon, you can see Canon, Nikon, 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 Canon, Sony, Nikon, Canon, Sony, Canon, 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 Sony, Nikon, Nikon, Sony, Canon, Nikon, Canon in the top 20. Well, let's move. Let's see what we're. Do we even see Panasonic on here? Sony, Canon, 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 Nikon, Canon, Sony, Nikon, Canon, Nikon, Nikon, Sony, Canon, Canon, Nikon. Oh, there is the Panasonic GH4, along with Nikon, Pentax, Sony, and Olympus. So number 38 is where the GH4 ranks. And I would guess that's not due to the sensor size. I would guess that's due to all the awesome, amazing features of the GH4 aside from the sensor size. So to stay competitive and top out this chart against Canon, Nikon, and Sony, I think it might be wise for Panasonic to offer something a little bigger than Micro Four Thirds. Ben says, why should Panasonic spend an enormous amount of time and money to develop a new product lineup when its only advantage over existing entrants would be its current software? I don't think that's the only advantage. I think the hardware that Panasonic uses is also really nice, but okay. Yes, the GH series are great video cameras, and the Panasonic UI is better than Sony's any day. But it'd be much easier and cheaper for Sony to replicate and negate those advantages than it would be for Panasonic to build the hardware to match Sony's full-frame lineup. Okay, so this guy is going with the argument that it's just too difficult, it would cost too much for Panasonic to do it, so why even bother? Well, my argument to that is that just because something is difficult doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, and when you look at big changes in any realm, it usually takes quite a bit of investment for it to pay off in the long run. The biggest risks often have the biggest rewards, so to just stay comfortable with the current status quo isn't always ideal. Meanwhile, Micro Four Thirds sensors already produce output that suits an extremely wide range of photo and video needs, and that's only going to continue to improve over the years with new sensor technology. Absolutely, that's why don't get rid of Micro Four Thirds, just build upon it. Expand it for the people who want something a little bit more, but keep it for the people who don't necessarily need the bigger sensor. Sure, full frame will improve too, but at some point depth of field control will become the only meaningful IQ difference between the two formats. And at that point, Micro Four Thirds will still be smaller and more portable, and maybe by then the volume of sales will mean better economies of scale and more competitive pricing. Okay, so Micro Four Thirds being smaller and more portable, absolutely, you cannot argue against that. That is true. Smaller sensors means smaller bodies and smaller lenses in general, and also cheaper too, as well. But that doesn't mean it's significantly more portable or significantly smaller. If you compare it to cinema lenses, it's certainly not hardly any different between a full frame lens and a Micro Four Thirds lens. Yes, there is a difference, but when you're talking about video, that difference is negligible, in my opinion. When most people are building out their kits with rails and you've got tripods and support and monitors and all this stuff to rig on it, if you're concerned about the difference between a slightly bigger lens and a slightly smaller lens, then it's really not that big of an issue. But secondly, it's not just about depth of field. You're talking about, okay, sensors are getting better, and so Micro Four Thirds sensors will get better. Well, then the aps-c or Super 35 and full frame sensors will also be getting better. More dynamic range, better color, better low light, lower noise. It's just, as things improve, everything gets better. So it's constantly shifting goalposts. And I don't think, especially in terms of quality, that Micro Four Thirds, the smaller sensor, because you're limited by the physical space of the sensor, is going to be able to compete with what you could do on a larger sensor camera. Just look at what Sony is able to do with their sensors and Panasonic is doing with theirs. Now, that's not to say that it's a total equal playing field, because obviously differences in technology between the two companies attributes to some of that, but there is something to be said for the physical space that you have to work with on a larger sensor. And for depth of field, I think a lot of people think that I'm just this shallow depth of field junkie and I really want just the shallowest depth of field. That's not the case. I like control over the depth of field, and sometimes I want it shallow and sometimes I want it deeper, but I also want field of view, color, dynamic range, low light, etc. He finishes with, that last point is less likely to happen if Panasonic and or Olympus branch out into yet another new format. Micro Four Thirds has certain innate advantages over larger formats. It'd be a shame for Panasonic or Olympus to hedge their bets, lose focus, and reduce the quality of the system as a whole just to compete against products that other companies already do very well. It'd be a total waste of time. Sure, yes. If you don't want competition, then yes, just don't compete. And Panasonic and Olympus will do their thing, and Nikon, Canon, and Sony will do their thing. Except Sony is dominating because Canon and Nikon are stuck with their photography stuff. It's kind of like the only company doing any kind of iteration right now is Sony, who's pushing things forward, offering in-body stabilization, low light, 4K in-body. When you look at Canon, it's not there. Nikon, it's not there. They're resting on what they're comfortable with. And that's why everyone is looking to Sony and getting really excited about their cameras, and why they are quickly topping the list of best-selling cameras on Amazon, because they're innovating, because they're doing new and interesting things. Panasonic could jump on that bandwagon, but according to this guy, it'd be a total waste of time. Sandensea? No full frame. I've invested 9 micro four thirds lenses already. Go to Sony if you want full frame. Yes, why should there be any competition? Sony makes the most perfect cameras and they can do no wrong, so go to Sony if you want full frame. Well, like I've said, I'm not a fan of the Sony bodies. I think the Sony cameras come with a lot of... The 30-minute record limit is also a huge frustration I have with the Sony hybrid bodies. So no thanks. And the fact that you invested in 9 micro four thirds lenses already, okay, well, you can sell them or you can sell them. Or you can keep them and stick with micro four thirds. Do what suits you best. I'm going to skip those replies. John Yo says, I think people are hung up on full frame versus micro four thirds. Full sounds bigger and size matters. Just ask her. Had to throw that out there. Well, yes, full frame versus micro four thirds. There is something that sounds bigger and smaller in the name, but it's more than just the name. It's about the actual size of the sensor. Jared M. Johnson says, it doesn't matter how big your sensor is for 4K, only how good your sensor is and how big your aperture is, whatever field of view you want to shoot at. It's easier to make a big sensor have more dynamic range, but it seems like Panasonic wants to solve this with better sensor tech, not bigger sensors. As far as aperture, do people really need bigger than what's available on micro four thirds? I don't think so. This desire for full frame is really only fueled by the fact that people know about it, that it's measured. Okay. Well, for 4K, yeah, you don't want some of the crazy high megapixel counts that they're doing now for 4K video. You certainly don't need it, and it probably makes more problems than it's worth. So you look at stuff like the Sony a7S, which trades off megapixels for low light. That's a really nice move that you can do with a bigger sensor. And certainly dynamic range. A lot of the Sony cameras have 14 stops of dynamic range. The GH4 is lucky to have 12 if you're shooting vlog. So that is something to consider as well. And I think the main point that a lot of these people are the people who love the Metabones Speed Booster, which gives you a wider field of view, shallower depth of field, or faster aperture, rather, which effectively does the same thing, but you know what I mean. And these people love the Metabones Speed Booster, which effectively gives you a bigger sensor size, faking it, right, with an adapter. And they don't want Panasonic to actually make a bigger sensor size. There's an entire product devoted to solving the small sensor problem. Metabone saw a problem in the market and was like, hey, these cameras that people really like, they have a small sensor. Let's make it bigger. So that product exists just to fix the problem that Panasonic has made for themselves. So that's kind of interesting that these people don't think Panasonic should just fix the problem themselves and give you all the great benefits of not having a speed booster. Patrick says, just wondering if any of you really thinks Panasonic makes money by selling GH cameras for video productions. I certainly doubt they do. Well, Patrick, that certainly could be the case. However, if you go over to Facebook and you look at the GH user groups on Facebook, it's very rare, if at all, that anyone talks about photography. It is only video people, primarily. 99.9% of the people on there talk about video, because the GH4 was the first consumer camera to implement 4K, to my knowledge. So, yeah, I mean, Panasonic might not be making significant portions of their revenue off of video productions, but it could also be the case, seeing as the only Panasonic camera to crack into the top 40 on Amazon is the GH4, which is, by all accounts, mostly a video camera, because I'm sure there are people who use it for photography, but it wouldn't be my go-to as someone who takes photos. Sproggett says, back around 1985, I bought myself my very first SLR, a Minolta 7000. It was a cracking camera and offered 35mm film capability in a body that is almost exactly the same size as the Olympus OMD EM1. More than 30 years later, I have to believe that advances in electronics have brought us to the time and place where we should be able to reasonably expect a full-frame digital sensor in something of approximately that size. I'm heavily invested in Micro Four Thirds gear, EM1, GX1, and a bunch of lenses, but I would be absolutely trade it for something the size of my EM1 and a full-frame sensor, providing it was offered at a reasonable price. Have to think this is now possible. Sproggett, wonderful comment. Love it. All right, what do we got? That's a lot of replies. Bonhoy. Super 35 would be an advantage. Partly it would allow a greater depth of field. I think he means shallower, but it would also allow it to cut in better with higher end cameras as B-roll. I like how Panasonic do things and Micro Four Thirds in general, but unless Panasonic up their game significantly, I'm going to have to jump ship onto a different system. And looking around, Sony seemed to have a lot. This is, I think this guy, it just took the persona that I was talking about and just made this account to portray it. Full frame would be, I agree, an absurd decision, but Super 35 would bring a huge video market to an already popular camera, but would mean it could do more than simply sit on a drone. Its usual professional use right now and be the main camera on a production. I know a lot of people who use GH4 as a main camera. Yes, it's not the most popular, especially since there are a lot better offerings in the higher realm of video stuff, that you can buy or rent. But I like this guy's comment. He's talking about moving to Sony, and that's exactly what I've certainly been tempted to do. All those little things eat away at me in terms of what Sony's offering, and it's really frustrating wanting the great things about the Sony, but looking at the GH4 and seeing all the things that it does better. So that's why I kind of made the video saying, hey, let's get this thing together, Panasonic. Start now, right? In 10 years, it's going to be too late. In 20 years, it's going to be a totally different market anyway. We'll probably have light field cameras all over the place by then. But for the time being, moving to that sooner rather than later, I think would allow them to keep on the trajectory that they are rather than let Sony gobble up all their consumers. Jurikis. Sony isn't dominating with 11% sale that their FF has. Mr. All Cap says they're dominating mirrorless though. So is Canon with 3 lenses. I wonder how many of Sony's sales are of the A7 on clearance. Who's to say? This Amazon stuff, who knows? Maybe it's all rigged. Maybe these companies pay for their spot on this list. I doubt it, but it could be. And Sony has a long way to go. There are people who are exclusively Nikon and Canon shooters, and they cannot be budged because they've had a longer time period to build up their lens catalog. So that's the whole thing, right? Nikon and Canon have been doing it the longest, so they're the name brand. It takes a long time to build up a new brand, but you have to do it by innovating. You can't just do it by saying, oh, we have what they have, but it's a little smaller and it's a little lighter, so come over here. And people say, well, what about the dynamic range? What about the color? What about the low light? Oh yeah, we can't compete in those fields, but it's a little smaller and it's a little lighter. And all the other people say, no, I'll just stick with the lenses I have, the body I have. I'm happy with it, and it's giving me better images than what you can offer anyway. It takes time, right, to build up the name brand. So that's why I think Panasonic should start now rather than later. Sony has the right idea. Maybe they are at 11% market share full frame. Okay, I would expect that would grow, and I expect it to keep growing. Alphaus. Wow, Micro Four Thirds evangelists are getting really angry if someone mentions full frame. Let's face it, we all love Micro Four Thirds, but when it comes to truly professional work, it will always lag behind full frame. There's nothing full frame doesn't do that Micro Four Thirds does. Again, professionals' first concern is not size. However, low light capabilities and depth of field are a big concern, and Micro Four Thirds will never be able to truly compete here. For me, however, Four Thirds is good enough. But I do understand the argument that Panasonic should rethink its strategy regarding the professional needs, not the amateur though. Here, Micro Four Thirds should prevail. Funny how many here seem to think that a full frame camera would mean the end of Micro Four Thirds. That's how confident you are in the advantages of Micro Four Thirds. This guy nails it. Couldn't have said it better myself. talking about people out there who you're trying to win, right? Because a lot of these people say that Panasonic's not going to make profit if they go full frame, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so if we're talking about dollars, right? Well, let's pretend we're all Panasonic executives looking at the marketplace. You're telling me that you're going to compete with full frame cameras with a micro four thirds camera. It hasn't happened. It's not happening. Maybe aps-c. Maybe there's something to be said for Super 35 sensor size. But most people out there, photographers primarily, want to shoot full frame. A lot of them want to shoot medium format. You're talking even bigger sensor sizes at that point. And that's where it's headed, right? And video will eventually get to medium format, and that'll be the new rage, and everyone will be talking about shallow depth of field and dynamic range and color and all that stuff, right? So when you're stuck at micro four thirds saying, hey, our size, it's smaller and it's lighter weight. I said it in the first video. You can't put a GH4 in your pocket. People are talking about, oh, well, there are other cameras that you put a pancake lens on, you can kind of squeeze it in. You must have some big pockets. You do not fit those cameras in your pocket. Even the Sony A7 cameras that are mirrorless and they have a big sensor, and the whole idea is that they're compact, right? Which in my mind probably leads to the issue of battery life and overheating. So I think it's kind of silly that Sony have stuck so hard to making the smallest camera possible, because even that camera you can't fit in your pocket. You can fit a phone in your pocket, you can fit a point and shoot in your pocket, but any camera with a bigger sensor, even like micro four thirds, right? Bigger sensor with interchangeable lenses is not going to fit in your pocket. So the size at a certain point, it's not even a valid argument. There's other things to be concerned about, because no matter what, you carry it around your neck, you put it in your bag, it's not going in your pocket. So I like this Alphaeos guy. Maybe I'll do a few more of these comments and wrap it up from there. That's a lot of the same stuff, you know, people just saying, I'm wrong, no, I'm right. And that's what it's all about, right? I mean, these are just opinions. Like, no one actually knows. I don't assume any of these people actually work for Panasonic. And it has been confirmed, I think, by someone said from Panasonic that the GH5 will be micro four thirds. The GH5 will be micro four thirds. But they didn't say they weren't developing an aps-c or full frame camera. They just said the GH5 is going to be micro four thirds. All right. Jurycast. We already read a comment from him. Keep going, keep going. Tim Tom. Oh, and by the way, Panasonic does have a full frame body with serious video capabilities. It's called Leica SL. Haha. Well, Leica, yeah. Just slap a few extra thousand on there because it's got the Leica name. All right. Taylor, Che, okay, I don't even, that looks like a different language. Boston C. Panasonic already benefits commercially from full frame, though its involvement with Reds, through its involvement with Red and Leica. I'm sure it has many internal debates over the years whether to go directly into producing its own branded full frame cams. And needless to say, it hasn't, because it's not sure of the market opportunity and the cost benefit are there. This guy, I assume he's referring to me, is obviously asking for a fully featured full frame camera that costs significantly less than Sony. No, I'm not asking for it to cost less than Sony. If it's on par with what Sony's doing, I think that's totally fine. Sony, by the way, the A6300, let's go look this up. A6300, $1,000 camera with an aps-c sensor. Bigger sensor than what's in the GH4. Cheaper camera. Not saying the sensor is the only price, but the only factor in terms of price, but that is good to note that you can have bigger sensors, newer cameras for cheaper cost. All right, what was Boston C saying? This guy's obviously asking for a fully featured full frame camera that costs significantly less than Sony. No, it can be on par. It's difficult to pull it off by Panasonic since the latter does not have as much sensor research production capability in spite of its partial ownership of Tower Jazz. In full frame cams, sensor cost factors much higher. 100%. I understand it's going to be more expensive. Panasonic have Super 35 sensors in their professional cameras. Maybe they're just trying to keep that away from the consumer area. I don't know, and I don't know how much those sensors even cost. I'm not an insider at Panasonic, so I couldn't even begin to speculate. But if Sony can do it, I would imagine that it would be beneficial for Panasonic to try and do it at the same prices that Sony is currently doing it. People need to know the vast majority sensor and processor R&D money is trickled down from the smartphone. That's 20 times bigger market than MILC in terms of sales. I think that's mirrorless something. I'm not familiar with that acronym. If a company like Panasonic has little presence there, there is no dough for serious R&D compared with competitors who have. Unfortunately, this applies to both Pani and Olympus. Before Panasonic can go heavy on full frame, Panasonic has to hit hard on smartphone and be a major player. That won't happen given the market condition. Well, Panasonic did introduce that CM1 smartphone, I think. So I think they're trying to get there, but it just takes time. And I don't know if what this guy said is 100% true. I'll take his word for it that, it comes from smartphone development in terms of the sensor tech. Okay. I'm not sure how that works for Nikon and Canon, but I do know that they sometimes get sensors like from Sony and whatnot. So there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff going on there, and it's hard to say what comes from where, but there are camera companies making cameras that don't have anything to do with smartphones. Blackmagic comes to mind. Now we have these craft camera people coming out at NAB. They're trying to make a camera. I don't know what sensor they're using. Red's making sensors. Aries making sensors. Granted, those are really expensive cameras, but it can be done. Carl, I truly believe most video people demanding a full frame sensor don't even know what they want it for. The depth of field aesthetic you get is overkill, and the low light can be achieved through larger pixel sights and back illumination. If Pani put a 12 megapixel BSI sensor in the GH5, it would be perfect. I think there's some truth there. I think what he says is maybe a little extreme. They don't even know what they want it for. Well, yes and no. I'm sure there's some people who just want a bigger sensor because, hey, it's a bigger sensor and that sounds better. But I think field of view, color, dynamic range, all the things we've been talking about is really important. And the bigger your sensor, the bigger you can make those pixel sights and the better low light you can get. So yes, technology can always improve, and the GH5 could be a lot better, even with the micro four thirds sensor, but that doesn't mean it's going to be better than the full frame counterpart or the Super 35 counterpart. So I'm going to end it there because my little baby is starting to fuss. Sorry if you've been hearing that in the background, and this has been 30 minutes. So 30 minutes of comments, and we'll see. I'd love to hear your comments. I try and respond to everything on my YouTube channel. So if you do have a comment on this, please feel free to leave it there, and I will try and get back to you.